Pete Peterson.
There he is, the man, the myth, the legend. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Greetings from Pepperdine.
Greetings from Pepperdine. How is Pepperdine today?
Yeah, it's another beautiful day here on campus. We are off and running in our fall semester into week 4 of the fall, and just so great to see students back on campus and events and classes and other things going on. So it's a great time to be here in Malibu.
Awesome. Is Pepperdine experiencing any of this election season stuff going on? How is Pepperdine faring with all that?
Well, particularly here at the Graduate Policy School, we've actually hosted a couple of events already this year that highlighted and focused on issues pertaining to the elections. About 3 weeks ago, we partnered with the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, which is a federal commission of presidential appointees from both Democrat and Republican parties that are essentially tasked with supporting election administrators around the country. And so we hosted a conference just about election administration here a few weeks ago. And then last week was Constitution Day week, and we partnered with the National Conference on Citizenship, looking not only at voting, but other ways that people are getting involved civically, particularly through volunteering. And we highlighted a couple of Los Angeles-based nonprofits that are doing some great work on education and homelessness.
Awesome. So, given that we are, I guess, in the election season, all the stuff starts to come up, right? About everyone and everything becomes top of mind, from issues to the politicians. And I guess something I'd love to hear from your around your thoughts around this is, what is the problem with politics in 2022?
Well, I think if I were to frame it in one phrase, it's fear of the future. And I think that is being seen on both the left and right and perceived in different ways. But the through line between the two is a fear of what's coming or what might come. And so certainly on the left, there is a fear of a continuation of the violence that we saw on January 6th. And certainly I think there's a general antipathy towards former President Trump. And even though he obviously won't be on the ballot, he has certainly inserted himself in a variety of races. And so, and is certainly being used as a foil in some ways by the Democratic Party to turn out the vote on that side. On the right, there's a fear of what might be called a growing woke movement on the left, which is certainly being seen in school districts and businesses and other places. And you certainly saw that at play in the Virginia gubernatorial race last year, in which many of these issues around education, the COVID lockdowns, were very much on the ballot, and certainly did, even in a purplish blue state like Virginia, generated enough turnout to put a Republican candidate and now Governor Youngkin into the governor's mansion.
Oh boy! So we've got fear of Trump, on the left, and we've got fear of over-wokism, on the right, and this is all playing into even, do you think, local politics?
Well, I think it is. And just to touch base on one of the real tectonic plate shifting events in politics and American politics in the last few years was COVID. And I think what COVID did in many ways, and I have raised this as a point of comparison, as someone who really got very engaged and frankly aware politically in the wake of 9/11. 9/11 was a national crisis that really shifted the focus of Americans on issues that were both federal and global, right? We remember this term, the global war on terror. And certainly the creation of federal agencies, the intelligence apparatus, and so forth. Much of the discussion around policy and politics was much more at that level. What COVID has done is really shift the focus in some ways that are mirrored, but also different. As Americans have come to understand that we don't just live in a country, and we don't even just live in states, we live in counties and municipalities. Because what we saw in the policy and political responses to COVID, and in some cases continue to see, are differences in how different counties react to it, even here in California, and certainly how different states are reacting to COVID response. And in that, there is a greater emphasis on what's happening at the local level. Certainly the Dobbs decision in the Supreme Court regarding the overturning of Roe v. Wade has taken what was a federal policy around abortion and has now shifted the attention to states. And we've already seen in a couple states like Kansas, where measures have been proposed either as ballot measures or state legislative pieces that, again, the attention is now being focused at the state and more local level. So I think with that, there's an increasing politicization that's coming down to the more local level as well.
Oh, boy. So, I mean, how do you feel that these candidates that are running are going to begin to incorporate that into some of their messaging? Or do you feel that they're going to run on some of the values of at the federal level, these policies or these issues, these group politics, I guess, identity politics, even in a lot of ways?
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that there has been a populist movement on both the left and right that is fundamentally changing the opinions and set of policy priorities on both the part of Democrats and Republicans. Of course, we have seen that most dramatically in the presidency of former President Trump and his impact on the party, and particularly a certain set of issues have begun to dominate the Republican Party in ways that have changed significantly. I'll just point to two, but it's worth just showing how things have shifted. Number one, immigration. Very easy to go back 10 or 15 years and find clips from Republican candidates saying that we want more immigration. We're a very pro-immigration party. We definitely want to welcome people to get involved in our businesses and so on. And at the same time, you can go back a dozen years to clips you can find on YouTube from current President Biden as a Democrat arguing against opening immigration policy. That focus at the time for the Democrats was on protecting union, lower and lower middle class jobs that were seen to be at stake with higher unskilled immigration coming into the United States. But you've seen a real sea change just on that issue as to how Democrats and Republicans are viewing that. The second issue is around free trade. And what's called free trade and understood as free trade has always been a mantra for Republicans. But in many ways, in particular, because under President Trump, the Republicans began to tie what they viewed as national security issues to trade issues. in particular in response to a growing perceived threat from China, that you saw Republicans talking for the first time about tariffs, which, of course, has never been a part of the Republican mindset for decades. And even this broader understanding, which goes back certainly to the fall of the Berlin Wall, that it was the feeling of Republicans that we just need to trade people into freedom. And certainly that's been the approach toward China, which has gone through both administrations, really, in many ways. But certainly under President Trump, that has changed. So again, I think that the parties themselves are going through an identity crisis. You're certainly seeing Democrats now being very much pro-immigration in ways they weren't 10 years ago. You're seeing Democrats, I think, in some ways becoming more highly ideological. This is certainly the case on issues of sexual identity, just to take one piece. Questions that weren't really even raised 10 years ago around sex education, certainly around the trans movement, have now become essentially understood parts of the Democratic Party platform. So again, I think the identity of the parties themselves is leading to a change in the kinds of candidates and their messages that are running.
Sure. Yeah. Why do you think that they're taking such strong positions as a party on things like gender identity and everything that comes with that, right? Decisions that can be made by youths without parent approval, like stuff like that. Why do you think? And why?
Well, I think it's in two senses. One is it extends the logical conclusion of a certain view, and this can be seen on the right as well, but it's certainly, this is the manifestation on the left of what I would call a radical individualism, which is to say that if you believe that, government shouldn't be in the bedroom, so to speak, that was the big phrase, as we think back a couple decades ago, that is a sense morphed into, I can essentially assume my own identity and I don't need the government telling me who I am. And not only that, but it needs to be protected and celebrated. Then we would believe that we would move essentially to a place where there don't appear to be boundaries on what's generally, or at least traditionally, been accepted in the area of sexual identity. So to me, in some ways, that's a natural play out. In the other sense, there is grown, and I heard a recent interview on on kind of the history of the group, the Human Rights Campaign, which was very much a part of the gay rights movement, and I would argue an important part of that. But after Obergefell and after gay rights and gay marriage were essentially placed into policy and law by the Obergefell ruling, it wasn't as if groups like the Human Rights Campaign necessarily said, okay, I guess we're done. We've accomplished our goal. What happened was there was a move toward another category, which in this case was the transgender movement. And so you do have around these issues as well, very well run, very capable, experienced political movement organizers, very well funded, that have essentially now moved around the transgender movement in ways that I think are continuing to drive our politics and policy.
Yeah. Well, and just to go, I guess, to talk about the other side for a second, one of the arguments around you mentioned gay rights, for example, and of course, religion has always been, I guess, strict reading of the Bible, or however you interpret the Bible, could make you feel a certain way around how gay rights should be supported or not supported. And of course, at the same time, we have this separation of church and state that we're supposed to have. Where do you see the conflict there? Is there a conflict? How do you experience things like that? Whether in general, we can use, gay rights as sort of the main activator of that. Of course, Roe v. Wade is another one.
Yep.
Where's religion's place in this? Is there too much religious push on this? How come that's not mentioned if there is? And what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I would see that at two levels. One is at the constitutional level, and the second is at the personal level. So the constitutional level is simply the First Amendment, which guarantees protection for religious liberty, for the practice of religion, while at the same time assuring that the government itself will not get into the practice of creating a state religion. So oftentimes people read the First Amendment to the Constitution and see that as simply encouraging religious participation, but it really is a two-sided coin. It's really the allowing of religious practice, but at the same time making sure government doesn't get directly involved in it. And in that, as all the cultural trend lines seem to be going in a more secularized direction, the importance of that constitutional, not just principle, but that constitutional reality that people of faith should be protected in the practice of their faith, I think is going to become increasingly important. We certainly are seeing more of these kinds of cases, whether it's the Christian nonprofit that is offering adoption services and decides not to offer adoption services to same-sex couples, certainly in religious education and religious schools, that there should be protection as put forth in the Constitution for these individuals and organizations. So that's at one level. The second level is the personal. And again, as we become arguably a much more secularized society, I think it is worth, as a person of faith myself, in understanding that increasingly the positions that I might have on these issues are not just grounds for they're not just grounds for my own personal predispositions and what I would wish. They are occurring within a democratic republic in which the people are allowed to decide what they view to be, I don't want to say right or wrong, but what is going to be celebrated or not. And in that, I think Christians are increasingly understanding that their views, whether it be on gay marriage, and certainly as we look now into the transgender movement, that they have been increasingly or decreasingly popular positions. But again, to go back to the first principle on constitutionality, people should still be protected and allowed to hold those positions, even if they are popularly unpopular, if I could use that phrase.
Sure, I hear you. Well, one of the things around all these issues is something I know you speak about. There's civic virtues.
Yeah.
Right. And the most important one, I believe, to be, or one that is very relatable that people can experience day to day, really, is the humility.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, it's it really is, and I agree with you, Evan. It is the grounding for a political culture that not only encourages but expects debate, discussion, and persuasion to be the methods by which policy and politics are held, as opposed to force. Right? This goes back to the first of the Federalist Papers, in which the founders are wondering whether there could be a government established by deliberation as opposed to force. And so in that is not just simply a set of rules and regulations. It's not just simply the Constitution and the organization of a government. It requires that people, citizens, act in a particular way that can make best use of this constitutional system to peacefully and in civil ways resolve disagreements. And in that essential civic virtue is humility, which is required for people that hold their perspectives on policy, whether it be gay marriage or trans rights or how we educate our kids. But requires a degree of humility when engaging with someone else who may hold a very different position. Because if it just does become a matter of force, then that just goes straight down the line to as being the way that Americans, in this case, would see resolving any disagreement. And certainly we've seen an increasing amount of political violence on both the left and right, certainly the right being, one would argue, most visible in January 6th and the conclusion of the 2020 election. But I think it's my fear and the fear of others that political violence is being seen as being more acceptable because we are not entering into our policy debates in a way that is grounded in humility on both sides.
Yeah, there's a term actually, and it's funny because I know you've been talking about this for a while, but there's a term that was recently on Bill Maher that he mentioned called Presentism.
Yes, I saw that.
It was interesting because
it is.
We've been, planning on doing this, and then around the same time, I know that's one of your things you've been talking about for a while, and then just recently he brings this up, and I'm like, wow, that was like just a few days ago, I think, or last week. And actually, I was impressed with that. It was also, I guess, synchronicity to some degree.
Yeah.
Which is the idea that you're basing your beliefs today on, or what people did back in the day, rather, based on your beliefs of today, as if the circumstances and the way that we think and look at things are all the same, and your values are exactly the same. Like, and you can't do that. So that's
right.
Presentism. Yeah. And that pretty much aligns with what I've actually even hear you speak about today, but in previous lectures as well, around humility, knowing that we would have been very different people 500 years ago. Yeah. And we have to respect that people are always trying to do the best they can. Yeah. Which is, philosophically a point of, I guess, a lot of philosophers like to make, right? We're all trying to do the best under our set of circumstances that we can.
No, that's right, Evan. And so to take the conversation around humility, the next step, I was just arguing as to why humility is important. But the next question is, well, then how do you get there? And one of the ways that we certainly teach here at the policy school, and I know it's I saw that Bill Maher clip on the describing of the condition of presentism, is to come to this rather humble place that there's nothing new under the sun, A, and B, that, to agree very much with the way that you put it, everybody's doing the best they can under the circumstances that they are facing. And to take that view that anything before us is ipso facto corrupted because people are acting in ways or holding beliefs of a certain kind that are no longer fashionable, then that also then should open the window to how are people 50, 100 years from now going to be looking back on the beliefs that we hold?
Right.
And now, that being said, I would argue that there are timeless principles, that many of the arguments around the founding on human nature and the importance of limited government as a way of promoting community building and civic ownership. I think those are timeless arguments that for many of the founders went back to Athens and Rome. And so there are certainly very contemporary issues, but even something like COVID, the historian Neil Ferguson, who's up at the Hoover Institution and also teaches at Harvard, wrote a book called Doom, very upbeat title, but it was essentially the history of pandemics. And even as we think about COVID-19 and all the different, isn't this like such a scientific issue and nobody's ever dealt with this before? Well, humanity's been dealing with pandemics since ancient times. And there are actually lessons that we can learn. And this is the point of Ferguson's book, that we actually took some steps in our response, the broader response of countries, particularly the United States, to COVID, that really demonstrated that we didn't learn what happened in the 1959 pandemic. One that, frankly, I really didn't know a lot about before reading the book, but that was a major pandemic in the United States, not to mention the smallpox outbreak back in 1918 and 1919. And so that presentism can become really a way of saying that we are the end of history here ourselves, while not learning from history, which is, of course, one of its most valuable purposes.
Yeah, and you actually talk about a term for this called applied history.
Right.
A way, I guess, a heuristic or a way of thinking about history that is part of history and political philosophy. Can you explain a little bit about that and how it works?
It's really a big part of our graduate policy program here, which I mentioned before, Neil Ferguson, he's been a very big proponent of this, which is a view of history as not just looking back at a certain time or place and seeing what had happened then, but what are the lessons that we can apply today from those instances. And I think this book, Doom, is really one of those instances where even on something like pandemic response, there was a lot there that we could have learned from previous generations and their battles against it, even with the scientific knowledge being much different, even with certainly the public health apparatus being generally less equipped. There were still some lessons there, which if our scientists, as expert as they may be in virology, appeared to display a real lack of historical awareness to the ways that other generations have responded to and learned from pandemics.
Why do you think that is? Why would, I'll say, I don't want to call it, we could say it was that was neglected. Let's go with it was unintentional.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Or was some of it intentional? I don't know. Like, what is your, why do you think they are not doing that if saving the world is the most important thing?
Well, there's a funny, maybe may not be funny to some in my world, but there is a mantra that's applied sometimes to people going on for advanced degrees, which is the process of knowing more and more about less and less. And that view, I think, is where science becomes scientism. Now, scientism is a view of science which becomes very hyper-focused on a particular lens through which to understand or analyze a particular issue. And I think one of the challenges that we saw in our broader response to COVID is not only did we have this virological, if that's a word, focus on stopping the pandemic, we did that at the exclusion of other public health interests, for example, psychological. So the whole field of psychology for months was telling those who would listen that these shutdowns and lockdowns were going to have an adverse effect on mental health. But of course, that was seen as being secondary to stopping the virus and stopping the spread of the virus. And it's one thing to prioritize and say, well, this is just more important than increased levels of loneliness and depression and addiction and so forth. It's another thing to go where I think we went, unfortunately, which is just to dismiss out of hand any other consideration within even the public health discussion about what was important. And I just raised that to say that this was happening within public health. To introduce an entirely different discipline like history and say, it's not just what you're seeing through the microscope, folks. There's also we can use another discipline here, in this case, history, to understand and at least get a better sense of how other generations, again, have responded to these issues. I just didn't, and obviously, Professor Ferguson, his main reason for writing the book was really to say that even in things that seem to be highly scientific, that the importance of understanding and applying history really should be part of the way that we understand policy and even public health challenges.
Sure. Well, I think also people confuse science with fact. Science is not equal fact. Science is a process
Very
best
good.
we have
Yes.
to coming to objective truths.
Yeah.
And not necessarily even absolute truths.
Yeah.
Right. Even Newton's laws didn't work for a long time, and then Einstein came along and made some modifications and realized, well, actually, under these circumstances, things now work like this.
Yep.
It is interesting that people use science as if, well, if the science says so, then that's true. Now, it is the best thing we have. Often the science does ultimately reveal these things.
Yep.
And look, average lifespan is twice what it was. And to me, that's because of medicine.
Yeah.
People were breathing in burnt plastic, working late, eating the worst foods possible. And somehow, that was 100 years ago. And in some places, they're still doing it.
They're still doing it. That's right.
And the average lifespan is doubled. So science for sure has its place. I think it's how,
for sure,
as if every single thing that comes out of a peer-reviewed study equals fact.
Right.
It actually means it's fact under these it's as close to fact, objective truth, not even fact. It's objective truth under these circumstances with these experiments, and this is the data we've collected. There's a million confounding variables often in these in times, and it's interesting that I feel a lot of times society just, I don't know if they understand that. I think they think, right, and I'll even ask people, and I'd love to ask you as well, I don't think people are even speaking in the same lexicon often.
Yeah.
They don't even know, they don't have the same definitions of the word fact. I ask everyone, what's a fact?
Yeah.
Tell me what a fact is, because everyone says, oh, these are the facts. These are the facts. No, it's a fact. Trump did this thing. No, it's a fact. Biden did this thing. You're like, wait, what are you choosing to make a fact versus have faith that what the people are telling you and where they got their information from is true. It's
Yeah.
ultimately, even people who don't have faith in religion still take faith
In something.
seriously in their life.
Yeah, they do.
And this is one of those things where I'm always so confused. So why do you think that is? I'll ask two questions. One, why do you think that is? And two, what is your experience with people in the word fact, with speaking about facts?
Yeah.
And what is your definition of a word fact? Start with the first one. I'll come back.
Yeah, and I certainly didn't come into this conversation thinking about this, but it strikes me that if we take as given that America and much of the Western world is becoming increasingly secularized, and I just say as a point of comparison, much of Africa and Latin America is not. It is becoming increasingly more religiously devout.
Right.
But just to say the West, as we become more secularized, I believe that there's a natural human desire for a passion for the truth. I think that's one of the things that sets us apart as unique creatures on the planet. And in that, if we become more and more secularized, meaning that we don't hold a certain metaphysical view of the truth, we will increasingly place prioritize what might be called material truths, ones that we believe we can hold on to and argue for. And I do think that might be part of the issue that we're having now around the quest for truth, is that there's a desire for it, but what had always been held as this metaphysical, I'm holding my hand up here, but maybe the hand should be down here, this foundation that we agree that there is a truth. As that gets wiped away, the focus, that desire on the part of us as human beings really focuses on, well, what are the things that I can hold on to that I can know are truth? So I think that's one reason. The other reason is that from a philosophical perspective, really ever since the Enlightenment in some ways, there has been a move towards the withering attack on a concept known as the truth. It certainly began with attacks on religion. Some of those very valid, by the way, given the way religion was being practiced in certain places and times. But it has morphed into a broader questioning of whether there is something that could even be called the truth or not. And once that takes hold of a society and there either isn't truth, or another phrase that I know you and I hear often, well, that's your truth. So you have your truth and I have my truth. And if those two truths actually come into conflict, if you say your truth is the sky is blue and I say the sky is green, well, that's your truth.
So a truth is actually subjective.
Then it becomes completely subjective, which of course is completely antithetical to the understanding of what truth is.
Right. So then we can't even use the word truth, actually, because you're just describing how you feel.
That's right. And so truth has become synonymous with feelings, which are nonetheless very important. But if they become the definition of truth, then we find ourselves in this place where there's this increasing focus and emphasis on facts and arguing for a set of facts. Because in that, I really do believe, as we get back to that question of human nature, that we desire for truth. We seek it. And whether we seek it in some sort of metaphysical pursuit, or without that, in some sort of material pursuit, that is going to be the grounding for our behavior.
All right. So we have, at this point, a truth is sort of subjective. We have,
if it exists at all.
Yeah. And we'll call it, right. Okay. And then we have the word fact, which also means something. So tell me your definition of a fact.
Well, I would hold those two things as synonymous, right? And I do think that truth and fact, the fact is a representation of the truth held in a particular context. And I do think that when I talk about this search for truth, the focus on facts and a view of the importance of facts, I think is part and parcel around this broader search for truth.
Right. So when we're having these conversations and trying to have civil discourse, right, and we're watching how polarized and how people really terrorize each other, and they name call, and they say horrible things about people who have the same values and aspirations as them. Like, I know that 99.9% of the people in this country all want safe streets, good education for their kids, no home, help the homeless. They're like, and some people see things from either side. And a lot of times I think it really is. And the reason I suppose I even harp on the words is like, if people aren't even speaking the same language, how can they even communicate effectively? And I feel that when people say, oh, it's a fact, if you don't understand what that means, or, oh, no, it's true. This is the truth. And I think that's one of the rudimentary issues with even the conversation. And I'm wondering how, without telling everyone to go look in the dictionary or coming up with a set of terms we can use, how do we get people to start having this humility? To start treating people like people, to see that they're people just like them. They have kids. They go to,
So I offer two things. One, I think, and it's a book that we use here at the policy school. And of course, we're a graduate policy school, so all of our students are going into policy or politics in some way, shape, or form. And one of the texts that we use is Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, which Haidt is a social psychologist at NYU, a self-described atheist Jew, center-left, but began research into why these crazy conservatives could look at the same policy issue as a progressive and come up with a diametrically opposed opinion about it. And that quest, actually working as a consultant to Democratic political campaigns, led him into a discussion around what he calls 5 moral foundations. And these 5 moral foundations, he argues, have been at the core of every human civilization in the history of the world. And they range from a focus or passion for caring, fairness, all the way to holding something sacred within a culture, whatever that, it may not even be religious, but just holding something sacred. And what he found in doing the other research was once he came up with these 5 moral foundations and created moral quandaries around each one of these moral foundations, that self-described conservatives and self-described progressives would respond in much different ways. Even with the same exact prompt, when given the chance to hear a moral challenge, they would respond much differently. And what that has helped me to understand, really as somebody more on the right, is that it is very possible to look at the same set of circumstances and come to a very different point of view. And one of the things I think is so important about that perspective is it allows me, when engaging in a conversation with somebody who sees the world differently politically, to get to that point of humility to understand, I might not be seeing this completely. And unfortunately, as you say, we've stopped short of getting to that deeper level conversation Because once I know how you vote, or car you drive, or area where you live, then I know all I need to know about you and I can write you off. And I do think it's going to take first being aware that it's possible for people of good intention, very high IQ people to look at the same situation and come away with very different solutions. It's important that we start with that. And then the second piece I've found, and you touched on this when you said, there are things that we all agree on, next generation, our kids, and safe streets, and those kinds of things. The work that we do, and we have an institute here called the Davenport Institute, which does a lot of work consulting with local governments in how to host more inclusive and participatory public processes, is that before we're only called in when there's been a very polarizing local issue. Could be around public safety, could be around land use or planning, construction, education. But we start with the question, why do you love this place? And we've found that to be the essential grounding question before you get into, all right, so here's the policy issue. How are we going to respond to it? If we start there, if we start at, what are we going to do to reduce crime? Then all the other baggage sort of is going to jump in, right?
Yep.
But if we start at, why do you love Santa Monica? And as someone who lived in Santa Monica for 12 years, I knew why, and I'd be happy to argue with anybody why Santa Monica was 10 times better than Venice. When from the outside, you could drive from one end of Lincoln Boulevard to the next, and the outsider wouldn't know the difference. But I'm sure you know why it's better, and I know why it's better.
Yeah. Well, for starters, there's no potholes in Santa Monica.
But you start there, and again, that becomes a much different grounding for conversation, because people do know whatever they feel about how we should respond to crime or how we should respond to homelessness. They know why they love where they live, and you can find some real interesting common ground on that before you get into the policy argument. And I think that's the second piece. We don't talk much about we talk a lot about why we hate the way things are, but we don't talk a lot about why we love where we live. And I think that's an important place to begin.
It's so interesting you say that. And I think that's, well, one, it's brilliant. And two, when I was chair of the Ocean Park Neighborhood Association here, one of the things that I did when I started my term is have everyone go around for 5 minutes and set the intention about what their favorite restaurant or something, their favorite thing to do in Santa Monica, or something about Santa Monica that they held dear, and they can share that. And you start seeing people like, oh, I love that place, or oh, that is a perfect. And it only takes a few minutes because you can't take the whole meeting up for that.
Yeah.
Right? The reason people get together is to continually improve things, and hopefully that comes with talking about problems. But if you start with that, I found that sets such a nice tone.
Yeah.
Right. And it was great. And people felt not only that, but they start to connect. Like there's a feeling of camaraderie. The second that you hear someone has like this connection, you're building connection, each person who goes around. So, so I not only aligned with that, I think it's beautiful. I wish we can instill that in every conversation before people start talking politics. At council meetings, just all right, 5 minutes. We're opening with good things that we
I love that
on.
idea. Yeah,
I mean,
it really does reorient a public conversation, which is why when we get a chance to consult with cities, we make a point of saying this needs to be your foundational question. You'll get to the policy issue. You'll get there. But if you just start with that, then you're starting with conflict. And frankly, you're not starting in reality, because there is a love that we all have for the places in which we live, and want to improve them, exactly as you say. But at the same time, it starts with something.
Right. I'm experiencing now, at the local election level, it's amazing. I don't think, I actually believe that most people don't know what's going on at all for the most part. There's like slivers of truth, but I believe there's ulterior motives, that people don't say everything on TV, and then they don't tell everyone what, if you're the president, you don't tell everyone everything. You're going to say what you want them to hear, and then they take that and report that on the news. People aren't reading the policies, 1,000-page policies. And that's at the federal level. And if you trickle that down here, like, we can't even get to the politics of a development on the corner of 5th in Arizona, or like the park, this stuff at Reed Park. Like, there's so many politics around even the most things that people would never, ever read or know about if you didn't live in Santa Monica. And even then, only 2% of the population knows the politics in a place like Santa Monica. So like, I'm seeing like mean stuff, like where it's not even sometimes the politicians, right? Or the people running, rather, like where the PACs decide to say something about the other people and make some slanderous comment about someone else. And I'm like, and you're like, wait a second, what's going on here? Like, why aren't you talking about what you're great at, instead of bringing other people down to raise yourself high?
Yeah.
And I don't know where everything gets lost here. I don't know if is it financial? Is it ego? Is it the act of fundraising that's so disastrous? And I have tons of issue with the fundraising
part of politics.
And so what is it that prevents us from getting to that place? Do we just need to tell people? Is it when we talk to people, we'll be like, hey, I only start a conversation like this. You want to get into politics? I need the first 2 minutes to be about good stuff. How do we do this?
Well, again, I think one of the things that we've found when we consult with cities is one of the great ironies of public comment in our council and commission meetings is that it is entirely, in each of its parts, entirely contradictory or antithetical to the principles of good dialogue. And if that is your only point of contact with the public is through public comment in council or commission meetings, then essentially what you're doing is you're only engaging the public through a process that's almost guaranteed to conflict, right? You're inviting people to overcome the number one human fear, which is public speaking. You're limiting what they can say to 2 and 3 minute snippets. You can't interrupt them if you happen to be on council commission. People can say really whatever they want. There was an LA Times story a couple of years ago, and I don't know how they did this, but they tracked the number of swear words uttered in public comment at the LA County supervisorial meetings. And it goes up like this over the last 3 years. And so
they did like a word cloud.
they somehow managed to count the swears per 10,000 words. That was the thing. And again, it is a chart that even in the early 2010s kind of flattens along like this. And over the last 5 years, it's just gone like this. And because we allow it, we allow that kind of behavior in many of our public settings. And you're not engaging residents with one another in that place. It's always kind of 1 on 5, 1 on 7
right
there. And you're
not a discussion.
You're not inviting dialogue, which really does need to happen if the public is going to create something called public policy. So many of the projects that we consult on are run in parallel to council and commission meetings. We will do a more facilitated process, report out, and we may report that into a council or commission meeting. But again, it provides another way of engaging residents in policymaking.
Yeah. Robby George did that lecture at Pepperdine.
Yes. Yep.
And this guy has more credentials than.
Yes, he does.
He's got about 2 minutes worth of reading off credentials, but he's the professor of jurisprudence at Princeton.
That's right. Yeah.
And then a million other civil things.
That's right.
Did, right? Okay. Yep. Internationally, nationally, one of the things that he said in his lecture was, challenging perspective is I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something like challenging perspectives is not just important to assess the correctness or position of our beliefs. It's how we learn.
Yeah.
If you don't challenge yourself in anything, then if you don't challenge yourself physically, then you can't physically grow. If you don't challenge yourself in basketball, you can't improve.
Right.
If you don't challenge the way you think, then you can't improve. And you simply lose perspective. If one person feels a certain way, there's a lot of other people who feel that way too. Yeah. Generally. Yeah. Not all the time, but in a lot of these political type conversations. Right. And if is there a resistance to learning new things? Is that
I think, a thing? Again, Evan, I think you raise an important part from an argument from Dr. George in that lecture. What could also be said to build on that is not only are we putting ourselves into places where our opinions aren't being challenged, but we're actually doing something much worse. We're putting ourselves into places where our opinions are only being celebrated. So, and our quest for applause and human identity, seen most dramatically in social media, is an environment that naturally contributes to creating what I call an ideological monoculture. It's one thing just to think a thought on your own and not necessarily have it challenged, but not always be too sure whether you're right or wrong, because you're never really in a place where you're talking about it with other people. It's a much different thing to be in a place where everyone around you has the same opinion and you are seen and given credence, legitimacy, and authority for being the loudest voice of that particular opinion. And
the most controversial.
And pushing the fringes of it. You're absolutely the boundaries of it. So you're absolutely right. And so learning does only happen in an environment, as you say, where our opinions can be challenged, deepened, improved upon, and confirmed, right? You may find that, even upon testing, that your opinion is the right opinion. But we've actually swung the other way. And again, I think it's exacerbated by social media, where we have intentionally put ourselves into places where our opinions are only hardened. And when you do come into contact with that different opinion, your only response can be, what is wrong with that person? Because you have never really been challenged.
Right. On
it by your own.
Yeah. And it's, ironically, a lot of the people who would, I don't know, maybe we'll say I'll put them on the left, who also praise science. Ironically, the whole purpose of science is exactly that.
Yes.
It's the whole reason science exists. Again, it's not, science doesn't equal fact. Science equals methodology, best we have, and we have science to thank for everything. I can talk to my mom across the country. I can, there's, it's an impeccable, well, not impeccable, but it's nearly impeccable process.
Yes, it is.
So, part of that comes down to the humility there, but, it seems that we're stemming more towards, and I'll say again at the same time, where the narcissism and the individuality of how important the importance of the individual versus the importance of the individual within the community.
Yeah.
And the importance of, as Robby George speaks about again in his lecture, self-mastery.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And the practices of Stoicism and the best philosophers that we've, right. So I think and it's not to say that there's a right or wrong, but rather there's a balance of how we need to exist and coexist together so that we can be civil. I try to get out of right and wrong.
Yeah.
I stopped even taking perspectives unless I have to actually vote. And then even then, it doesn't mean I don't feel both ways sometimes.
Right. Oh yeah.
You just have to make a choice.
The great journalist of the early part of the 20th century, Walter Lippmann, described the problem of voting is it's up or down. It's either one way or the other. And of course, none of us, or at least with some exceptions, sure, feel so compelled about particular issues that we shouldn't have some degree of misgiving or questioning about it,
Right.
But our political process, and we're glad to have it, of course, but really only offers yes, no, up, down kinds of participation through elections.
Yeah.
And what we try to do again in some of the consulting work we do with cities is we try to do things pre-ballot box to more shape and customize policy decisions in a way that fit the community in which they're working.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it is just the gravitation towards extremism too. And people just love to feel, I don't know, a sense of purpose that they have power over something that they're not involved in at all.
Yeah.
I always tell people, why do you even watch the news? What's the point? If you want to do anything, get involved locally and you can actually make change. Like today, go to your neighborhood. Right. You're worried about stuff that doesn't even matter for you very often.
Yes.
So, or that you're unwilling to do anything about. Not that you couldn't, but.
Well, and I would just offer on that, I think back to one of our first points in the conversation, that if politics, with increasing secularization, we will see politics be made into a religion. And that can happen on the left and right.
There's a Nietzsche line here.
Yeah. Well, again, if there isn't, if we understand that we are beings intended to pursue the truth and to worship, which I believe that we are, that we will hold things as sacred, whatever they may be, whether material or spiritual, that if the spiritual is leveled, then all of our focus and all of those energies and desires will be put into material things. And unfortunately, politics can be a way of approximating religion in its focus on the future and the future that we will make together. And again, if politics does become, and unfortunately, I think in many cases is becoming a religion, it's a bad religion.
I guess there's a lot to do.
Yeah.
We have a lot of work to do. But I guess, as I always say, the purpose of this country is to improve the country. Yeah. And the Constitution is written that way, right? And I forget, is it in the preamble about creating a more perfect union?
More perfect union. Yep.
So that's what it's intended. It's not perfect, but the quality of life around the world is the best it's ever been. Right? We used to we don't deal with stuff like the level of gratitude that I believe that we need to have when we wake up in the morning for what we have.
Yeah.
We have it so easy compared to 20, 50, 100, 200 years ago. And
true.
Maybe today we can go off with a little bit of gratitude for how good we have it and hope that people can come together and make things a little nicer and a little warmer for each other.
I believe that's possible. And I believe gratitude really is a powerful civic virtue. I think we're ending this conversation really on the right note. That is a powerful civic virtue.
Well, on that note, I wish we had the entire day to do this. I loved this conversation. Your mind should be part of other people's minds in many ways. And thank you for your time. Thanks for being here. And I hope we can spread some civility and improve maybe just a few people. This conversation. Yeah.
Thanks, Evan.
My pleasure, sir.